Welcome to RWM Blue Water Ministry. I'm your host, Bob Manock. If you like this message, hit the like button, and if you want to see more, subscribe. We're continuing today in our series, Church and State, and today's episode is 3.5.1, The Climate Emergency, Part 1. In today's episode, I will introduce you to Allie Beth Stuckey and the Relatable Podcast. She is a Christian who addresses many kinds of cultural issues from a faith-based worldview. Today, she is addressing the World Global Leaders meeting in Egypt discussing climate change with author Marc Morano. This is part 1 of their discussion, and next time we will see part 2. So let's get right to it.
The world's global leaders met at a climate summit this month in Egypt. What did they talk about? The radical transformation of society. But don't worry, Klaus Schwab says it's for your own good. I'm going to be talking to Marc Morano today. He is the author of a book called The Great Reset, Global Elites and the Permanent Lockdown. He has written several other books about this subject. We're going to talk about climate change today and also this climate change conference and what the global leaders are cooking up. Now, if you are like me, this conversation kind of makes you feel demoralized, scared, hopeless. Well, he's going to have some words of encouragement for us at the end, but I also wanted to start off with this reminder. I love this passage from Psalm 2, also Psalm 37, one of my favorite passages, as you know, is a great complement to this, but let me read you this and just keep this in mind as we talk to Marc today. This is Psalm 2, verses 1 through 4. We'll see. It might be longer than that. Why did the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth set themselves and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, let us burst their bonds apart and cast away their cords from us. He who sits in the heavens laughs. The Lord holds them in derision. Then he will speak to them in his wrath and will terrify them in his fury, saying, as for me, I have set my king on Zion, my holy hill. So we remember through all of this that God is in charge, that he is bigger than the American government, than world governments, than China, than the World Economic Forum, and that nothing is too difficult for him and that nothing can thwart his will, as Job 42:2 says. So we always have hope. I mean, we have hope in this life, but more importantly, we have hope eternally too. Well, Mr. Morano, thank you so much for joining us. Can you tell everyone who might not know who you are and what you do?
I'm Marc Morano, the publisher of Climate Depot, daily information source for environment, climate, energy news, formerly United States Senate Environment Public Works Committee, and the author of several books, including Green Fraud, Why the Green New Deal is Worse Than You Think, and also The Great Reset, Global Elites and the Permanent Lockdown.
How did this become your expertise?
Good question. I grew up, what I would always say, as a Republican, except when it came to environmental issues. I was a volunteer on Ronald Reagan's 1980 campaign, so I was always concerned about environmental issues. As such, I got caught up in the Save the Rainforest campaigns in the 90s, and then by the time I realized that we'd been essentially exaggerated all these climate things, I ended up doing a documentary on the Amazon rainforest back in, filmed it in the late 90s. It aired in 2000. And that really opened my eyes to all the exaggeration and falsehoods that were being perpetrated from sometimes legitimate environmental concerns, and now they would exploit it. So when climate came along, I was already pretty much skeptical, and I worked in the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee. And then when this COVID came along and did the Great Reset, COVID lockdowns, which then led to the World Economic Forum pronouncing time for a Great Reset, I had learned everything about COVID lockdowns and censorship from my 2 decades fighting the climate battle. It's like that book from the 1980s. Everything I needed to know, I learned in kindergarten. Well, everything I needed to know about COVID lockdowns, the Great Reset, I had learned during the climate debate. It was the same exact template. So I approached this whole issue, all these issues, as an investigative reporter. I have a background in communications and reporting. I was a White House, Capitol Hill press credentialed, and I worked as a working journalist and investigative journalist, did documentaries on a host of environmental issues, from wetlands, endangered species, and agriculture, and that. So that's my background.
Yeah.
I'm not a scientist, but I like to say I sometimes play one on TV, and that really riles up some of the other side.
There are a lot of issues that have probably been exaggerated or that we've been given misinformation about, and yet this climate issue is one that has persisted for decades. And it's really amazing how wrong the scientists and the so-called climate experts have been in a lot of their predictions, and yet they are still given credibility. We are still told that we have to believe them unconditionally. And not only that, but it's got a hold of at least one whole political party in the United States, and also global leaders. I mean, you talked about the World Economic Forum. This is like their issue. How did that happen? I mean, there are a lot of issues that I guess we could have taken hold of and said, this is our issue and we really have to fight for this, whatever it is. How did this become the interest of so many people in power?
Well, in my previous book, Green Fraud, I go through the origins of essentially the Green New Deal. And what we find out, if you go back to the 1960s, before there was climate change, there was the overpopulation myth by Paul Ehrlich, the overpopulation bomb. Yeah. The population bomb is what it was called, worried about overpopulation. And he made all of the same kind of climate catastrophe things, but this time using overpopulation. He said we would be running out of food, resource scarcity, there'd be famines, there'd be mass deaths, that the world needed to have radical transformation. And by the way, central planning. And then in the 1970s, you had a man-made global cooling scare. And this was legit. I mean, you had all these scientists write a letter to President Nixon at the time, warning of man-made global cooling. So before fossil fuels caused global warming, fossil fuels allegedly caused man-made global cooling. They thought our aerosols from the burning of fossil fuels were blocking out the sun, which I wish I could do on the right side of my head there. And they thought that was causing this essentially global dimming, which was cooling the earth. And they were blaming bad weather, wars, famines, all sorts of things on man-made global cooling. And here's the interesting thing. I spent a whole chapter in my book showing that the solutions to all of these previous environmental scares, overpopulation, global cooling, even the species extinction and deforestation, the solution was always the same: more government control, more sovereignty limiting treaties, an end of private property rights, an end of free markets, massive wealth redistribution. So the reason global warming has persisted, and it really didn't kick in until 1989 when NASA scientist James Hansen testified on the Hill, in 1988, and then also the United Nations formed their climate panel. That's when they basically said, we're going to get all the environmental issues think of it like a big poker game. They're going to put all our chips in on climate. And that's what they've done. So every other issue has been subservient to climate since then. And guess what the solutions to climate were? The exact same solutions to every previous environmental scare. And that's what we face right now. And if you go back and look at the Rio Earth Summit from 1992, which then President George H.W. Bush attended, they literally sound the United Nations Sustainable Development. It reads like a carbon copy of the Green New Deal. And I detail, here's excerpts from the United Nations Sustainable Development in the early 90s. Here's AOC's Green New Deal. So all that is a retread of the past several decades of the same climate solutions for previous environmental scares.
Basically, what you're saying is that the reason that this gained so much traction, especially among what we would call elites or, global leaders, is because it is such an effective vehicle for power.
Yes.
And for the radical transformation of economies, of political systems, of society. Basically, if you can tell people that there is an existential threat and you and your family are going to die and the world as you know it is going to come to an end unless we do something, unless we take control, then I guess they think that that is a good enough premise, a good enough reason to take control and to kind of enact that radical transformation. Is there any legitimacy, though? Like you were talking about in the 1960s and 70s, about these people who thought that there was a great global cooling and a change to global warming. Like, is there any legitimacy in this climate science, or is it all activism?
Yeah, in fact, I was just hit by the BBC came out. Do you believe in climate change is caused by man? Well, here's the way you break it down. It's not a simple question in that regard, but mankind is not driving any climate catastrophe or climate emergency. Can mankind influence the climate? Yes. Our CO2 emissions can cause some level of warming, but at this point, and many of the climate scientists say you can't even detect what the climate would be naturally versus what it would be with mankind's influence. In other words, there are quite literally hundreds of factors that influence the climate. It's the most complex system known to man, and everything from tilt of the Earth's axis to water vapor to clouds to methane to volcanoes to the sun, and all these feedbacks come up with the global temperature. So the idea that they can pick one politically selected factor on the margin, carbon dioxide, and then say, if we control that, we can control storms and weathers and hurricanes. And here's the kicker, Allie, on every time scale, and this is acknowledged in national climate assessments and even UN reports buried deep, hurricanes, floods, tornadoes, droughts, wildfires are either not increasing or on declining trends on 50 to 100 year time scales. Now, what they do to make everything sound scary and still be correct scientifically, they'll pick an area, say, Southwest California, and they'll pick, say, a 15-year period, and they'll say the drought in this one particular area is unprecedented, and our climate models show if we don't do something, it could be, the entire country will be in drought by the year 2100. And they're technically right that one area might be in an unprecedented drought, but unprecedented and record weather events and historic events happen every day, everywhere on the planet, have always happened. It's kind of like when you go into a casino and you see all the signs of the people winning the slot machines. You get the impression that everyone wins that's playing the slots. Well, if you watch the news or listen to Al Gore or the UN, they claim that every day is unprecedented weather and records being broken. But on actual climate time scale, it's not happening. And that includes sea level rise, which has been rising 10,000 plus years since the end of the last ice age, no acceleration. That includes polar bears. They are disappearing, but they're only disappearing from Al Gore's books and movies. He dropped them in his sequel 10 years after his first film. Why? Because they never counted so many polar bears. And it's generally known, even the indigenous people acknowledge, everyone acknowledges up in the Arctic, that polar bears are at or near historic population highs. And that's why you don't hear anyone talk about polar bears anymore.
I also saw something, because we hear about things like the Great Barrier Reef and how it's depleting. Yes. I actually saw that it's like at its record highest amount of coral in like 40 years or something like that. I mean, how does that happen if climate change is just getting worse and worse and all of our resources are being depleted?
Yeah, I mean, in fact, I remember NBC News Today Show would do, like, during Earth Week, they would go and film at the Barrier Reef. This is decades ago, just warning of all the danger. All the new science is showing it's resilient, it's gaining coverage, it's not dying as predicted. And this is true even of all these low-lying Pacific islands, the Maldives and Tuvalu. They're building airports, hotels. What happens is when current reality fails to alarm in the climate, they make scarier and scarier predictions of the future. And it's all based on data models, which they try to claim as data. But it's just a prediction of tuned models that scientists, put in these inputs, which they believe mankind is driving a catastrophe. And of course, presto, they come out with scary scenarios. But just real quick, you mentioned the failed predictions. 1995, New York Times predicted East Coast beaches, according to climate experts, East Coast beaches could be underwater. In 1989, the UN said we had a 10-year tipping point by which to act. In 2007, Al Gore issued the same 10-year tipping point. In my book, Green Fraud, I go back to 1864 when Abraham Lincoln was president. I found an academic named George Marsh Perkins who actually warned that unless mankind changed their evil ways, we faced climatic excess. Abraham Lincoln was president when the first climate tipping point was issued.
So you think, and I mean, through your research, you talked about this at the beginning, the parallel between the conversation about COVID from these same people and the conversations about climate change, they're almost identical, that we have to transform society and kind of lock people down and really control people's behavior in order to save people. But as we saw in the lockdowns, that actually ended a lot of lives. I just saw a study that showed that 1 million cancer diagnoses went missed, estimated, over the past couple of years because people were told to stay home because they were scared to go to the doctor. They didn't die from COVID, but they did end up dying from their cancer. And so we would see the same thing if they got their way when it comes to these climate lockdowns or the climate restrictions that they want to put in place. We're already seeing some, as you just said, about not financing, gas-powered cars. But if they really got everything that they wanted, if they got completely open borders, if they got no private property and no private ownership, and they really did just have, I don't even know if you could call it communism, feudalism, I guess, is more accurate. If they got all of that, if they completely defeated fossil fuels, I mean, we are talking about the deaths of billions of people probably, right? I mean, is that what they want, these kind of Malthusian people?
Interesting way to put it. I think they're looking for essentially the current population to age and die off, and then future populations control. Many of the people, and I interviewed Hans Schulenhuber, the German climate advisor, who's at all these United Nations climate summits. He's one of these people and many others who believe the carrying capacity of the Earth is only about 1 billion people. Well, we have about almost 8 billion now. I think it's 7.9 billion. So they're talking about eventual elimination because the Earth can't handle it, species can't handle it, trees can't handle it, our natural ecosystems can't handle it, the distribution systems of food and medicine can't handle it. So they're ultimately trying to essentially, I guess the word would be manage the society. They're not necessarily talking about killing. They're not talking about killing people now, but they're talking about future generations really radically cutting back. Now, the interesting thing is, if left to their own devices of market forces, generally, like Al Gore was worried about African population being, that were projected to be higher than China and India combined. Wealth and development is one of the most proven ways to lower population. In fact, as a country gets wealthier, the number of kids that families have invariably drops. We've seen it happen all over the world over the past few centuries, and there's no reason to think that won't happen. What's weird about it is they want to prevent that wealth under the name of somehow overpopulation fears from countries, and that's what's happening in Africa. It's a new form of colonialism that they're doing. They're telling them they can't make the same mistakes that we made here in the West with fossil fuels because they'll make the climate catastrophe worse. So Africa can't make the same mistakes of development, cheap fossil fuels, wealth, longer life expectancy, lower infant mortality, cleaner air, cleaner water, and better infrastructure. I mean, they can't make those mistakes. Instead, you have to have wealthy white Westerners go in and tell them how to manage their economy. And to make sure it happens, the UN sets up a climate slush fund that quite literally pays African and South American leaders who are best able to keep their people locked in poverty. In other words, the more poverty you have, the lower your emissions you are, the better steward of the climate you are. And that's what the UN, I've talked to development activists in South Africa about this. They literally pay the governments and the leaders who are best able to keep their people locked in poverty, and then they give this money, and of course these leaders can then use it to ensure their own re-election.
Evil. It's evil.
So we will stop the video right there and continue with part 2 next time. This is Bob Manuk, declaring blessings on you and yours until we meet again. Amen.